Previously on APUS history, the United States declares war on Germany. That shouldn't be of any surprise to anybody. It's kind of expected when you sink somebody's ship for the better part of about 3 years. Now, what we talked about last time is the fact that Woodrow Wilson and Congress, they don't just declare war on Germany and the Central Powers. They declare war to make the world safe for democracy. And I asked you guys, what the heck does that actually mean? Nobody really knows. We'll kind of find out when we actually get to the conference that negotiates the end of the First World War, the Treaty of Versailles. But for now, remember that the United States is at war, and even though it's not going to be a very long war for the United States, the fact is that we make a lot of changes because, from our perspective, the war has been going on for a very long time. We've been bystanders. We entered the war in 1917, but remember, Europeans have been at war since 1914. And it's been a very, very long war. And so because of that, the United States mobilizes, even though, realistically, the war itself is going to be very short. Now, the thing is that the United States was, let's say, inexperienced with modern warfare. The last war that the United States fought against another country was the Spanish-American War. And remember, for the most part, that was a short war and a naval war. This war, the First World War, is going to be the largest war since the American Civil War in terms of the number of troops mobilized. The U.S., before the declaration of war in 1917, only had about 120,000 soldiers, which might seem like a lot, but when you consider the fact that battles like Verdun and the Somme would chew through 500,000 to 600,000 troops in a single battle, 120,000 troops is a drop in the bucket. Eventually, the United States would mobilize roughly 5 million troops, and many of them would be sent over 3,500 to 4,000 miles overseas. The United States has never done anything quite like this before. And the fact that it could at all was because of the fact that the United States becomes a major industrial power during the Gilded Age. However, we can't forget the fact that the First World War just doesn't have that Pearl Harbor moment. And the reason I use the term Pearl Harbor moment, I mean, it's not like a scientific term or anything. Pearl Harbor was a surprise attack launched by the Japanese Empire, which started America's official involvement in the Second World War. And Pearl Harbor, to a certain extent, was a personal and national tragedy, but it crystallized the issues. It made America going to war more palatable to the majority of the American people. World War I, though, doesn't have that singular causal event. For the United States, we don't get involved because of the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. We don't even have exactly kind of a cause or pretext like the explosion on the USS Maine or the massacre along the Rio Grande or Nueces River during the Mexican-American War. Remember, we had the Lusitania in 1915, but it's not until 1917 that the United States officially goes to war with Germany. As a consequence of that, many Americans just aren't quite sure why we're involved in the first place. It's certainly not because of Franz Ferdinand or European politics. And at the same time, there's no singular causal event that we can point to and say, that's it. That's why we fight. We don't have that reason. We don't have that singular event. So, as a consequence, World War I basically joins a club of other wars throughout American history that, on the one hand, are unpopular in some quarters, but very supported in others. World War One, the Mexican-American War, and the Vietnam War, and also the War of 1812 are interesting wars because you're either going to find people extremely in favor of those wars or extremely opposed to those wars. Nobody really talks about probably the most controversial war in recent American history, the Korean War. If you actually look at popular polling of the Korean War, by the way, up until I think maybe very recently, the Korean War was the most unpopular war in modern times. But if you ask Americans today, what is the most unpopular war in recent memory, they might mention the Vietnam War or the Iraq War. And what's interesting about those types of wars is that you're going to find people extremely opposed to those conflicts, but at the same time, you're also going to find people who are very supportive. And World War I was very similar in that respect. You had people like Woodrow Wilson, to a certain extent Theodore Roosevelt, people who believed that this was kind of an opportunity for the United States to kind of play a more active role on the world stage. At the same time, you had people who believed that this is sort of a continuation of that embrace of empire, which, as we talked about, was very unpopular in certain quarters. So let's talk about the changes that Woodrow Wilson and Congress passed during the First World War. Now, basically, I'm going to summarize and say it passes conscription. You actually have the introduction of rationing, daylight savings time, and also the government plays a more active role in negotiating on behalf of labor. So selective service is just what it sounds like. It's basically the United States implementing sort of a limited form of the draft. And it does exactly what it sounds like it does. It's a partial mobilization of all available manpower. If you remember the Civil War, and hopefully you should, it's like the one thing in the course that hopefully kind of stands out to you. The Civil War had, if there's one thing that Northern and Southern troops could sort of agree upon, is the fact that it was a rich man's war, poor man's fight. And remember that battle cry was more common in the southern states than the northern states. But this was a reflection of the fact that if you were a wealthier American, you had more opportunities to basically get out of the draft. Now, the thing is that in the First World War, the army that was drafted was poorer, more rural, and less educated than the army that fought the Civil War, and certainly the army that fought World War II. It was an army that basically was, in some respects, a Jim Crow army. And we'll talk about that more in just a little bit. But 13% of the army was composed of African Americans, and they basically marched and fought in their own units and regiments. Also, it was an army that tended to conscript poorer Americans and younger Americans. It was also an army that sort of organized itself with the IQ test. It's actually the first time the IQ test is used, at least to this scale. The thing is that if you got a high score on the IQ test, you would typically be placed in some kind of support role, non-combat positions. You might be somebody who would be stationed in headquarters, performing sort of administrative or logistical roles. But typically, the lower you scored on the IQ test, the more likely it would be that you would basically be cannon fodder. You would serve on in infantry units on the Western Front, and it's those units that took by far the highest casualties in the First World War. So the question is, how do you mobilize the economy for war? And I'll just give you guys a little suggestion. You should remember all this here, not just for the First World War, but also for the Second World War, because basically you're going to see similar policies that the United States implements during both conflicts. So Congress creates the War Industries Board. By the way, once again, we have yet another government acronym that you have to memorize. The War Industries Board basically tries to streamline military production for the war effort by taking corporations and basically merging them together in some cases. Now, if you remember the Clayton Antitrust Act, which Wilson and Congress passed at the beginning of his first term, one of the things that's kind of startling about that is that, Wilson is a pro-labor politician. And yet, at this point, what he's doing is that he's not a trust buster, he's a trust maker. He's bringing companies together and merging them to make the war effort more efficient. You also have the mobilization of the clock to increase wartime production. This is where you begin to see the introduction of daylight savings time, which is something that everybody loves, right? Especially since we're in March. You also have the beginnings of rationing. You have meatless Mondays, wheatless Wednesdays, and fortunately the government instructed people that they could eat beans by all means. But I mean, you get to see sort of like these clever sort of rhyming devices to help people remember what types of food they were allowed to eat and what types of food they weren't allowed to eat on certain days. And remember, Wilson leads the Democratic Party. And we're still 30 or so years away from the Democratic Party of Grover Cleveland, the Democratic Party that sort of saw itself as the successor to Jeffersonian classical liberalism. The idea that the government doesn't have any role or responsibility in dictating your personal, it matters in your personal life, right? And by the way, what food you consume, that's a fairly personal decision, I would think. And in World War I, the government does just that. So you have the implementation of rationing. You also have, among other things, a National War Labor Board, which is basically created in order to encourage labor unions and businesses to agree upon some compromises. The reason this is sort of implemented is that even though Wilson and the Democratic Party are both pro-labor, in other words, pro-labor union, what they're really afraid of is that these labor unions, or at least most labor unions, which have a history of sometimes advocating for political causes, Wilson is worried that if these labor unions don't support the war effort, they might go on strike, and therefore they might actually grind the war effort to a halt. So in this case, what Wilson is basically doing is he's creating a mechanism so that labor unions and business leaders can come together and agree upon increases in wages, increases in benefits. Neither side gets exactly what they want, but at the very least, you do see increases in wages across the board. So, in some respects, what we observe in the First World War is that war is good for business, at least for the United States. The other European powers can't say that, it has to be said. The war itself shatters most of the European economies. And if you want to see kind of what leads to the decline of European empires like the British or the French, you're not going to really see that story in the Second World War so much. You're going to see that story in the colossal amount of debt that all of those European powers assumed during the First World War. That being said, though, for the United States, which spends most of the conflict on the sidelines. The fact is that it becomes more or less the factory for the rest of the world. The United States was the only country on earth that was still sort of reliably producing consumer goods. So, in some respects, the First World War, and it has to be said, the Second World War, was a good time period for American businesses and American farmers. There's one other important question, though. So, if we're mobilizing 5 million troops and training them and equipping them and sending them overseas, it's one thing to make these types of reforms, but the question is, who's going to pay for all that?
Strong and brave, here to save the American way.
Not all of us can storm a beach or drive a tank, but there's still a way all of us can fight.
Who else can fight like the man for what's right night and day?
Series E defense bonds. Each one you buy is a bullet in the barrel of your best guy's gun.
Who will campaign door to door for America? Carry the flag shore to shore for America. From Hoboken to Spokane, the stars spangled banner with a flag.
So, if you didn't catch that, by the way, I'm not saying that Captain America is going to pay for the war effort. He's got superpowers, but he's not that powerful. No, instead, what has to happen is we have to raise taxes, and just as important, we have to actually sell government bonds. So remember that for most of American history, tariffs and taxes go hand in hand. The tariff, at least for the federal government, was the tax. Remember that because of the Underwood Tariff Act and the 16th Amendment, the tariff kind of recedes as the primary source of government income or federal government income. Instead, what happens is that kind of as a consequence of the Gilded Age, we see the emergence of the national income tax. That being said, in 1912, the highest marginal tax bracket was 7%. What that means is that if you were basically in that top tax bracket, every dollar you made over that number, whatever that number was, would be taxed at 7%. So basically, for the richest Americans in 1912, the federal income tax was basically equal to the sales tax today in terms of how much people would have to pay. By 1918, however, that tax bracket or that tax rate jumped from 7% to 77%. And that's just within a span of about 6 years. Then it kind of goes down throughout the 1920s, but then once we see the emergence of the Great Depression and the United States goes to war in Europe in World War II, again, that tax rate goes up. Despite the fact that taxes increase 11-fold, in effect, it's still not enough. The federal government needs more money in order to fund the war effort, and the problem is that there's none to be had. So what happens is that the federal government dusts off that brand new Federal Reserve that was created at the beginning of Wilson's term, and the Federal Reserve basically starts issuing bonds. Now, this is kind of a civics point, but a government bond is basically an IOU or a loan. In normal circumstances, we think of a loan as being that thing that you or your parents get at a bank. The thing is that when the government is selling a bond, you are the banker. The American people play the role of being a banker. Because what happens is that the federal government is given some of your money, and in exchange, they agree to pay that money back sometime in the future, 10 years, 20 years later, with a little bit of interest tacked on. Now, the thing is that it's a bit of interest, more than you would probably get in a savings account, for example, but not as much as you could potentially make at the stock market. So, for the business class, or for Americans who just genuinely want to make a little bit of extra money, a bond is not necessarily an economically rational transaction. So, in other words, if you want money, if you're prioritizing making money, a bond probably isn't for you. So, the question is, how do you get people to buy bonds willingly, even though they could possibly make more money investing in the stock market? And the solution is, and any advertiser could probably tell you this, is celebrity endorsements. Not exactly Captain America, because he wasn't exactly around in World War I, but celebrities like Charlie Chaplin, who was really, to a certain extent, one of the first movie stars ever. Charlie Chaplin basically goes out and launches kind of a fundraising drive for the war effort. But not just Charlie Chaplin. I mean, one of the things that happens in war is that wars have a habit of producing war heroes. Just ask Teddy Roosevelt, who uses that kind of celebrity status to run for the governorship of New York. So in World War I, probably the best known American hero was Alvin York, who was this mean old cuss from eastern Tennessee, who apparently gets struck by lightning. And that sort of leads to this about face. He kind of turns his life around, becomes a pacifist, and then is drafted for the war. Now, the thing about York is eventually pacifists like York, where some of them were sort of convinced to support the war effort anyway. Others basically kept to their principles. But anyway, York was convinced to willingly serve in the army as a sniper. And apparently, in one battle, he basically single-handedly kills and or captures an entire company of German troops. In other words, about 100 or so men. I'm ballparking here. The thing is that almost immediately after York sort of demonstrates his talents as a one-man army, the military takes him off the front lines and sends him back to the United States, not to train other snipers, but instead to help sell Liberty bonds. So the thing is that there's a lot of marketing and a lot of propaganda that goes into this. And so one of the things that happens is that Wilson takes an old progressive muckraker by the name of George Creel, and Creel channels that muckraking, that sense of activism, into the war effort itself. And again, you have tons of kind of over-the-top propaganda posters. After a Zeppelin raid in London. But Mother had done nothing wrong, had she, Daddy? See, this little girl's crying. She's lost her mom. Now, how can you prevent this girl from crying? Well, you can invest in Liberty bonds. And by the way, that will supposedly prevent a transoceanic Zeppelin attack in New York, which, I mean, is so ridiculous to think about it, about that happening. But, don't let reality get in the way of good propaganda. Beat back the Hun with Liberty bonds. And apparently, look at this nice Zweihander, this two-handed sword wielded by this Boy Scout. But think about this. Yeah, look at this. Third Liberty Loan Campaign, Boy Scouts of America. Basically, what this means is that, I mean, I think, unless I'm misinterpreting this, is that they're getting Boy Scouts and little kids to basically buy Liberty bonds. And the same thing would happen in World War II, by the way, where you would have entire schools come together and pitch in money to purchase a Liberty bond. Or at least just donate money for the war effort. Now, the thing is that you know, that amount of money, I mean, unless school kids had higher allowances than they do today. The thing is that in most cases, we're not talking about a lot of money. But in some respects, that's not even the point. If you look at things like, for example, rationing, where the United States is trying to encourage people to be cognizant of resources they use like coal and gasoline, it's not as if that extra shovelful here is going to be the decisive shovelful of coal that will defeat Kaiser Wilhelm II and the German army. The thing is that rationing, saving resources, purchasing Liberty bonds, it all goes back to what has to happen in a total war. And remember, in a total war, the entire country has to get behind the war effort. The problem with fighting a war thousands of miles away is the fact that the war is so distant that it's hard for people to feel personally connected with the struggle. If you're a Frenchman in Paris, or if you're a German in Berlin, or if basically you're just in Europe between the years 1914 to 1918, you're going to see daily reminders of the war itself in terms of the carnage, in terms of casualty list. But remember, for the United States, the war is kind of distant. Much more distant than the Civil War was, and to be honest, in terms of casualties, I mean, the United States, our casualty numbers are in the low 100,000s, but still, we're not approaching anywhere near the amount of casualties we suffered during the American Civil War. If total war is a contest of wills, where the idea is that every person has to be mobilized for the war effort. Well, if there's not a daily reminder of the war, and if the government doesn't make a case for how individuals can participate in some way, shape, or form, then the thing is that people might lose interest. So the United States, interestingly, is in an enviable position in the First World War. It's far away from a lot of the fighting involved, but at the same time, it also suffers the disadvantage of being so far distant from the conflict that it might lose sight of the war itself. We'll talk a little bit more about some changes on the home front in our next lecture.